Hey, what is up, mortals? Welcome to part 2 season 3. I just wanted to greet you guys by just saying, sit back and relax, you're in for a treat. So, we begin. Izuku took off as fast as could, not stopping for anything. He felt how his body wanted to collapse. But he persisted to the end. He refused to let himself fall. Not until he knew that his classmates were safe. The green-haired boy quickly delivered his message to Mandalay, informing her that the students could use their quirks and that the villains were after Bakugo. He didn't stop for anything else. However, before running headfirst into the forest once again, Izuku searched meticulously, turning every single stone that he could find. He had his senses sharpened to the max. But that only served to make him extremely jumpy over anything that he saw. He searched for what felt like an eternity, but without any form of results. That is when he saw something odd lying on the ground. He looked closer towards it, only to be horrified when he saw what it was. It was a hand. A severed and bloody hand was lying on the ground in front of him. Not only that, this hand looked awfully familiar in some way. Izuku approached the disembodied hand carefully. But as he got closer, he could hear something loud and destructive in the distance. The greenette didn't get to fully acknowledge what it was. However, before he suddenly was pulled away, he almost began to panic, thinking that a villain had managed to grab onto him. But that quickly went away when he heard a familiar voice speak up. "Quiet, Midoriya. You might draw attention," it said, sounding as hushed and quiet as possible. Izuku immediately recognized this as Shoji, as he calmed himself down while asking, "Shoji, was that your hand out there?" With a concerned voice, the masked teen didn't budge upon hearing this, reassuring his classmate as he answered by saying, "Yes, but I can grow it back." With a calm voice, this had its intended effect, as Izuku took a deep breath before asking another question. "What happened here?" Shoji looked distraught after hearing this question. As if he didn't want to answer it, he quickly steeled himself. However, before saying, "It's Takoyami." He lost control. Dark shadow grows stronger when exposed to darkness, but it also becomes more violent. Takoyami was desperately trying to hold it back, and he lost control after we were ambushed. With a voice that carried a deep hint of concern behind it, Izuku was just quiet upon hearing this, his expression turning into one of shock. He was unsure of what to think about it, until his attention was drawn back to the loud ruckus. The center of said destruction was now visible to him, in the form of a demonically crazed dark shadow. The greenette's expression suddenly turned into one of concern upon witnessing this. He had heard about Takoyami's problem with controlling dark shadow in the dark, but he never imagined that it would be to this extent. The Raven teen's pain and desperation was open for all to see, and it in turn made Izuku desperate to help him. "Midoriya," Shoji then whispered, knocking Izuku out of his thoughts. The green-haired boy turned his attention towards Shoji, as he continued, "You're the strongest in our class. Therefore you might be the only one capable of doing this. But do you think that you can defeat Dark Shadow? Can you fend off Dark Shadow and maybe help Takoyami?" The masked teen pleaded, hoping that his green-haired classmate could do something. Izuku looked away upon hearing this, for he knew that Shoji wouldn't like his response. "No, I don't think I could take him in my current condition. Aizawa did a number on me. I'll drain my stamina very quickly by just flying. Even if I was in top condition, I doubt that I can do much. I doubt that Dark Shadow cares about exhaustion the same way that we do. And that's not even addressing its power," the green-haired boy said, keeping his voice hushed as he spoke. Shoji looked distraught upon hearing this, and one could hear the fierce clenching of his fist. "Is there really nothing we can do?" he uttered, voice perfectly reflecting his expression. Izuku understood this frustration, for he also wanted to help Takoyami. There was a way to help him, and that was to lead him towards the campgrounds where there would be enough light to suppress Dark Shadow. The problem, however, was that he would have to give up his search for Bakugo to execute this plan. "I have an idea. We could lead him back to the camp where there's enough light to stop Dark Shadow," Izuku then whispered, his voice trying to remain as calm as possible. Shoji was confused by this, as he said, "I appreciate your help, but shouldn't you be looking for Bakugo?" With what seemed to be a rather concerned voice, the greenette could feel his frustration boiling up within him, but he didn't let it cloud his judgment. The truth was that he wanted to find Bakugo more than anything right now. But that didn't mean he could just abandon Takoyami, and getting frustrated wasn't going to help them either. So he held it tight as he said, "That sentence. That right there has to be one of the most presumptuous things that I have heard in a long while." With a somewhat cold voice, Shoji was shocked by this unexpected response, as Izuku continued, "When pigs fly, when fish climb trees, when hell itself freezes over. Those are the only times that Kaken will allow himself to be defeated. Even by me. And if he's still with Todoroki, we should be more worried for the villains that are chasing them. The green-haired boy finished, unconsciously letting out some of his pent-up frustration. Shoji was even more shocked to hear this. It was natural for someone to be confident in one's friend. But this was a new extreme. To say that either yourself or your friend can't be defeated takes a lot of confidence and pride. But it almost made sense for Izuku. He was immensely powerful. Thus anyone who can stand up to him shouldn't be of their concern. But Shoji knew that Izuku was concerned for Bakugo. Him choosing to help Tokoyami could be seen as a rather bitter sacrifice. Alright, let's do this before someone gets hurt, the masked teen then said, focusing his mind on the task at hand. Izuku followed suit, taking a deep breath before responding. Yeah, let's move. The two teens gave a nod in confirmation upon saying that. Turning their attention back to the demonic shadow that was rampaging in the distance, they waited for the right opportunity to move. But before that happened, a loud bang could be heard in the distance. What was that? Shoji asked, sounding like he was a little frightened by the sudden noise. Izuku, however, wasn't frightened at all. He was smiling. That's an explosion. I'd recognize it anywhere, the green-haired boy exclaimed, excitement being clear in his voice. Shoji was confused by this reaction. And he would only get more confused when Izuku pointed his finger towards the direction of the blast before saying, change of plans, we're heading that way. Soundbeats. This video is sponsored by Soundbeats and their new True Free 2 wireless earbuds to provide the next level of quality and comfort. Ever gone out for a run and have to readjust your buds every 5 minutes? How about worry about getting caught in the rain and ruining your $200 earbuds? Well, those days are behind you. With an ergonomic design created to stay on even through the most rigorous workout or function through a cascade of rain with its IP7 water resistance. Enjoy 20 hours of battery life and seamless switching between earbuds without interruptions and at a fraction of the price of most premium earbuds. Check out the new True Free 2 wireless earbuds in the link in the description. Also, know that using the link below, you won't only get an excellent audio experience, you'll be supporting the channel so we can continue to provide the highest quality content possible. Each purchase helps, so if you're on the lookout for a new pair of buds, we've got you covered. Bakugo and Todoroki were in a bad spot. It was bad enough that the villains were after them. What made it worse was that they happened to run into an incredibly dangerous one. The villain that stood before them was insane, with massive blades shooting out of its teeth as it seemed to hunger for flesh. The two teens were on their toes constantly, not being allowed to breathe within the tempest of swords. Damn it, Bakugo shouted, right before sending an explosion towards the villain. The blast seemed to connect, but both teens knew that this would only slow him down for a couple of seconds. This is no good. We'll be turned into mincemeat at this rate, Todoroki then exclaimed, lightly panting between his words. Bakugo just grew more frustrated as he said, I know. So we'll have to beat him before that happens. Todoroki didn't look surprised after hearing the blonde's response. He just sighed as he stated, just so you know, we won't come out of this unscathed. With his usual calm and cold voice, Bakugo just grinned widely, with small explosions erupting from his hands as he answered, some extra scars won't kill you. With a fiery voice, Todoroki was unchanged by these words, as traces of both frost and embers appeared on his body. The villain had finally recovered from the stun. As it moved to continue with its onslaught, both teens stood ready to attack, when suddenly they could feel the ground shaking. Now they were confused, trying to trace the source of the rumble, until a familiar and desperate voice called out from behind them, Todoroki, Jr., make a light. They both turned to see that it was none other than Izuku, with a distressed Shoji running behind him. Both Bakugo and Todoroki were about to question the greenette, until they saw the demonically crazed dark shadow that was making its way over there. The blonde's first thought was to do as Izuku had instructed, but he stopped himself when remembering that he wasn't alone. The villain was still there and wouldn't be able to defeat him without getting injured, unless they let someone else handle it. Bakugo looked towards Todoroki, noticing that he had the exact same thought, before shouting, dodge, quite aggressively. The bi-colored teen did just as Bakugo ordered, jumping back at the same time as the blonde. Dark shadow missed them both and turned its attention towards the villain that was present. It tried to put up a fight, but in the end it was pounded by the nightmare creature. After the villain was defeated, both Todoroki and Bakugo were quick to create a light. Dark shadow slowly shrinked back into Tokoyami, until it was gone completely. The raven teen panted heavily as he both thanked and apologized to his classmates. But that was overlooked when Bakugo walked up to Izuku and asked, "Hey, Martian, why didn't you deal with that thing on your own?" With a usual hint of annoyance in his voice, Izuku got a little annoyed himself, as he responded by saying, 1. I am exhausted. 2. Dark Shadow is really strong. 3. I can't create a light source. With that same annoyance being present in his voice, Bakugo just scoffed upon hearing this, before proceeding to say, "So you're that weak? No wonder I can beat you." With more anger behind his words, Izuku got even more annoyed upon hearing this. But he didn't get to respond until Todoroki spoke up. "Can you save the pointless arguments for later? Right now we need to get out of here," the bi-colored teen said, his cold voice taking up the authority for now. Both Izuku and Bakugo were silent after hearing this, for they knew that Todoroki was right. "Good, we need to move. The villains are after Bakugo, so I suggest that we keep him in the middle as we walk. We should also keep Takoyami there with him. We can't risk Dark Shadow going berserk again," the ice user then said, passing out instructions for how to get to safety. Everyone seemed to agree with this plan, for it seemed to be the most efficient. But Izuku had another idea. The green-haired boy needed to speak with Bakugo about things that the others didn't know about. And they couldn't do that if the blonde was in the center where everyone could hear him. "All right, you take the lead, Todoroki, and I'll take the rear," Shoji then said, knocking Izuku out of his thought process. The group was just about to move out, until Izuku spoke up. "Actually, I'll take the rear and keep an eye on Junior. You take the middle and keep an eye on Takoyami," the green-haired boy said, his voice sounding stern as he spoke. Shoji was shocked at first, but he went with it. The truth was that he wanted to keep an eye on Takoyami, so this was just perfect for him. Todoroki wanted to ask for Izuku's reason, but he decided to brush it off as they all began moving with their new formation. Bakugo was walking right beside Izuku, confused with what he wanted. He knew that the greenette had a reason for doing what he did. He just didn't know why. "Is something wrong?" the blonde asked quietly, speaking so quietly that the others wouldn't hear him. Izuku was silent for a while. Then he sighed and said, "Aizawa knows my secret." With an equally quiet voice, Bakugo was shocked upon hearing this, for it was something that he didn't want to hear. "How?" the blonde whisper shouted, almost getting the attention of the others as he did. Izuku took another breath upon hearing this, before whispering once again, "I don't know, but he might be getting the wrong idea. He's doubting whether he can trust me or not." With a voice that sounded far more concerned this time, Bakugo gritted his teeth upon hearing this, for it was a bad outcome. The last thing they needed was for Aizawa to think that Izuku was a threat. "What about you? Any idea as to why the villains are after you specifically?" the greenette then asked, catching Bakugo off guard as he did. The blonde then thought for a second, before saying, "They seem to be quite obsessed with All Might. So it might have something to do with my quirk." With a tone that signified contemplation, Izuku was caught off guard by this response, for it was the last thing that he wanted to hear. He wouldn't like it no matter what Bakugo had said, but the villains somehow knowing about One for All is probably the single worst thing that could have come out of his mouth. The two continued to walk onwards while thinking about their situation and trying to find a way out. But that thought process was quickly broken. "Is there something that you'd like to share with the rest of us?" a slightly agitated voice called to them. Both Izuku and Bakugo looked to see that it was Todoroki, and that they had suddenly stopped walking. "What the hell are you talking about?" "Icy hot," Bakugo retorted, all while having a bad feeling about what the bi-colored teen was implying. Todoroki frowned upon hearing this as he walked past Takoyami and Shoji, until he was right in front of the blonde and said, "You know what I'm talking about. The two of you are hiding something. It's why you're insisting on staying in the far back despite it putting you in a vulnerable position. It's why you're whispering your entire conversation as we're walking. And I have been around the two of you long enough to notice how different you act when you're around me. You know something that we don't, something that I think is important enough to be shared." With a demanding voice, both Izuku and Bakugo were taken aback by this. They didn't know that Todoroki was capable of sounding so frightening. They didn't let themselves falter, however, as they retaliated. "Look, whatever me and Yoda decide to discuss is none of your damned business," Bakugo growled, clashing Todoroki's agitation with some fury of his own. The bi-colored teen only seemed to get more frustrated, as he responded by almost shouting, "None of my business. For all I know, you could have valuable information that could help us deal with the villains. Maybe even find out why they are after you of all people." Todoroki and Bakugo went back and forth with this argument. Normally it would be similar to the pointless buckles between Izuku and Bakugo, but this was different. With the blonde and the greenette, one could faintly tell that it was just their version of a friendly chatter. But this was different. Both contesters looked like they were ready to just attack each other. And things only got more heated as time went on. Enough already. Our situation is precarious as it is. The last thing that we need right now is to fight amongst ourselves, Shoji then shouted, moving in to break up the fight. Todoroki still looked agitated. So did Bakugo, but Shoji's words seemed to stop them for now. Todoroki, I understand your frustration, but let me assure you that whatever we know will likely not change anything. That information won't change the fact that we're in danger. And that Junior here is a target, so please calm down. Because if you continue, I'm afraid that you'll only see your father's worst qualities when you look in the mirror, Izuku then added, explaining his case to his bi-colored friend. Todoroki had a look of realization on his face after hearing this. He was just as much in the wrong here. Barging in on his friends like that and assuming that they're trying to betray him in some way. It all did make him seem like the worst side of his father. And that is the last thing that he wanted right now. The bi-colored teen now wore an apologetic look on his face as he turned to make amends with Bakugo. Before he could do that, however, he was disturbed by a rustling from a bush, which was followed by Izuku, who panicked and shouted, "Get back!" before pushing them all away. No one understood what was going on, but they got their answer when something massive dashed out of the shadows towards where they had just been standing. Izuku was still there. As such, he took the full force of whatever it was that had jumped at them and was sent flying into a nearby tree. Midoriya, Todoroki called out, his eyes being locked on Izuku. The green-haired boy was on his knees gasping for air and grunting in pain as the dark yet familiar figure approached him. "We meet again, you brat," the figure said, and Izuku knew immediately who it was. "Muscular," the green-haired boy muttered while still gasping. Muscular grinned after hearing this, before proceeding to say, "I'm glad that you remember me. Because I couldn't stop thinking about you. I couldn't stop thinking about how badly I wanted to fight you. That's why I came looking for you specifically." With his usual maniacal voice, the others watched as the greenette forced himself back up to his feet, until they decided to do something. Todoroki prepared to use his flames against the villain, but the second that he tried, a burst of blue fire crashed straight into his left side. The bi-colored teen winced in pain as another voice spoke up. "I wouldn't do that if I was you, Shoto Todoroki," showing another spectrum of maniacal sadism. Both Todoroki and Bakugo focused their attention onto the new burn-marked villain, as Muscular took some strange item out of his pocket. "Now then, let me see your blood," the crazy blonde then shouted, as he placed the object over one of his eyes. Suddenly the man's quirk started going ballistic, as his body transformed into a nightmarish being of nothing but ever-growing muscle fibers. Izuku didn't even get a second to react before Muscular was attacking him. The green-haired boy was pushed back immediately. He barely had any strength left. And it also didn't help that the villain he was facing was incredibly strong. He put up the best fight that he could, but it wasn't nearly enough. Muscular punched Izuku in the face, making his vision go hazy, before grabbing him by the arm and slamming him into the ground like a ragdoll. The ground cracked underneath the green-haired boy. As Muscular towered over him, the villain showed another one of his sadistic grins, before delivering a finishing blow to Izuku's gut. Everyone turned to see the results of this brutal attack, and they came close to throwing up. The attack had gone straight through Izuku, and it had actually made a hole in his stomach. Blood and gore were spilling out, and one could see the agony that the greenette was in. "Deku!" Bakugo shouted in desperation as he charged towards Muscular, leaving Todoroki to deal with the burned villain. The blonde was welled up with a torrent of emotions, as he used one for all to conjure up a massive explosion. Muscular didn't care, however, for the second that it landed. He grabbed Bakugo by the throat. The villain tightened his grip around the blonde's neck, choking him as he did. He then turned towards the trees and said, "I believe that this is who you've been looking for." Before throwing the teen, Bakugo crashed into a tree, right before suddenly turning into a blue marble and falling to the ground. As if on cue with this, another figure clad in a mask took that very same marble before disappearing into the woods. Todoroki was still holding the flame user back with his eyes, as he desperately held back his desire to go after Bakugo and get vengeance for Izuku. Suddenly, however, the villain backed off for no apparent reason. The ice user was about to give chase, but was suddenly attacked by the muscular villain. He was sent flying until he crashed into a tree, breaking it as he did. Todoroki coughed up some blood, and immediately noticed that Muscular was charging right at him. He tried to conjure up some ice walls in order to gain some distance, but the villain charged through them all as if they were made out of paper. Todoroki stood defenseless, as Muscular hit him again before lifting him up by the head And here I thought that you would be just as awesome as that green-haired brat. I guess that's what I get for having so much faith in his classmates," Muscular said, his filled with nothing but pure disappointment. Todoroki was in a slight daze. But he was quickly woken up by the sharp pain that arose in his head. It didn't take him long to realize what it was either. Muscular was tightening his grip around his skull. The pain made the bicolored teen very desperate, as he immediately began using his flames onto the villain's face. Muscular, once again, didn't seem to care as new fibers continued to grow and shield him. Todoroki could feel the intense pain well up in his head, which only made him crank up the heat even more, but it only showed the same results. Muscular didn't care. Todoroki could feel all of his sensations leave his body, and he couldn't tell if it was because of the pain in his head or the heat from his left side. His mind went everywhere. To Bakugo, who had been taken away, to Izuku, who lay bleeding out on the ground, and to his father, who he had found dead in an alleyway. All of these people had shaped him in some way. Yet here he was, about to waste everything that they had given him by letting himself get killed by a villain. Upon coming to this realization, Todoroki cranked the heat up even further with a furious bellow. He kept going, until he could barely stay conscious, until the area began to scorch, until he couldn't tell the difference between the smell of his own and the villain's burning flesh. Eventually the flames took on a beautifully blue color, followed by horrendous smoke. He kept going, until Muscular let go of him. The ice user fell to the ground, unable to stand as he looked up towards the villain. What remained of him was no more than a smelly corpse with a burnt stump that used to be a neck. The headless body of Muscular stood up for another 2 seconds, before falling backwards and crashing into the ground. Todoroki's hazy gaze quickly turned to the bloody crater where Izuku was lying. His injuries were bad, and he had stopped moving completely. He tried to drag himself towards him, but he barely had the strength to blink. He kept trying, over and over again, but with the same result every time. Eventually his body started feeling as light as a feather, before the darkness fell over him completely. Outro. Thank you all for sticking around, and I hope that you enjoyed. Before you leave, we would just like to let you know that We the Celestials has many other channels for your entertainment and viewing purposes. All the information you'll need is right below here in the description, so feel free to check out all the other incredible projects our team creates. Secondly, on behalf of We the Celestials, I'd like to thank everyone involved in the production of today's awesome content. Their details will be in the description below. That's all for today's video. So goodbye and have a divine day.